In 1962, Marvel superhero Spider-Man tragically learned a life-changing lesson. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. With this now famous phrase, Spider-Man succinctly summarizes the main motivation that typical superheroes have for donning their masks and capes and rushing out to save the world. Superman, for example, who debuted in 1938, has extraordinary powers. He has super strength, super speed, super vision, super hearing, and super intelligence, among other talents. By Spider-Man's well-known guidelines, Superman does seem to have certain responsibilities toward mankind. His motivation for vigilante crusading simply stems from this innate sense of responsibility. Things get a little more complicated when comic creators invent heroes without the fantastical abilities of Superman, Spider-Man, or other superheroes. For example, what possible motivations could an average Joe, let's say an ornithologist, model, or police officer with no super abilities, have for taking up a masked justice crusade? Imagine your dentist roaming the streets at night in a cape and stretchy unitard. In his thought-provoking article, Neerav Dwivedi explores connections between ideology and the concept of superheroes, particularly in regards to the compelling and influential graphic novel created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, Watchmen. Dwivedi is an English professor at Delhi University and published this piece in March of 2015. Almost 30 years after Watchmen was first published. This article was published by the International Journal of English Language, Literature, and Humanities. In his article, Dwivedi dives into ideological implications of caped crusading with a detailed analysis of Watchmen. Why would a bunch of grown men and women with little outstanding skill dress up in colorful and elaborate costumes to fight crime as vigilantes? What values must a person have to reach such personal extremes? And why must these characters so often fall into the category of superhero or supervillain? Watchmen has been analyzed time and time again, but this particular article will give us as new readers insights into the importance of these characters' motivations and ideals. Dwivedi begins his article by giving some background information about a phrase that ominously recurs often throughout Watchmen. Who watches the Watchmen? This phrase actually originates with Juvenal, a Roman and a satirical poet who wrote in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD. Juvenal wrote it about the guards who ensured the chastity of the women at the time. The original line was, "Who watches the watchman? The wife plans ahead and begins with them." Dwivedi uses this historical context to set up his analysis. He asks, how is it that the agent responsible for bringing security to society, if left unchecked, himself becomes an agent of greater insecurity, posing an even greater threat? Would the world then be a better place without superheroes? What is it that is painted as good and heroic in them? And who is the guarantor of these values? Or, to put it shortly, as the newspaper headlines in a comic book asks, why must there be a Superman? Dwivedi continues by discussing the concept of heroism and villainy, and by extension, the rightness or wrongness of any given action. Consider Ozymandias and Rorschach of Watchmen. How moral or right are either of their actions at the conclusion of the comic? How justified? The black and white concepts of heroism and villainy. Dwivedi comments that Watchmen turns these notions on their head. He uses a quote from Peter Coogan, the director of the Institute for Comic Studies, to define the concept of a superhero. A heroic character with a selfless, pro-social mission with superpowers, extraordinary abilities. advanced technology, or highly developed physical, mental, or mystical skills, who has a superhero identity embodied in a code name and iconic costume. The mission that this superhero is entrusted with requires him to do good for good's sake, fight for truth and justice, and right wrongs in society, all terms whose definitions derive from the accepted mores of the society. It is often assumed that comic book superheroes will always do the right thing. That is, whatever society considers to be right at that given time and place. In World War II era, Captain America punches Hitler in the face. In the 1950s, he smashes communists. Bottom line, typical comic book heroes toe the line of society's accepted morality, except when they don't. Dwivedi asks, what happens if we complicate the terms of heroism and villainy? For example, what if there existed a good terrorist or an evil freedom fighter? What if the superheroes presented have less than idealistic motivations, like greed or desire for power? At what point do these heroes cross into villainy if their motivations are not directly in line with the current morality of society? Dwivedi argues that it is necessary to be flexible with, as he says, these otherwise rigid and fixed givens, and see where it is that we inherit our notions of what is right and wrong, the need to situate and contextualize them. He analyzes several of the characters of Watchmen to do so. Dwivedi first looks into the motivations of the original Minutemen heroes. These characters have no super abilities. So what ideology emboldens and motivates them to fight crime in masks? Hollis Mason, also known as Night Owl's original career, was a police officer, and the morality passed down from his grandfather, along with the Pulp Fiction he reads, gives him the idea and encouragement. But he also does it because it's fun and he feels like it. Sally Jupiter, or Silk Spectre, was simply a dancer and model who used crime fighting to further her career. Hooded Justice approved of Hitler's Third Reich. Captain Metropolis made racially prejudiced statements about Black and Hispanic Americans. Mothman was committed to a mental institution, and the comedian commits sexual assault and cold-hearted murder. None of these embody the intrinsic integrity or righteous motivations one might hope for in a hero, and the only time they appear to be concerned about morality is when they are fighting crime in their masks. As original members introduced early in the graphic novel, they also indicate to the reader that Watchmen characters are not typical superheroes. The startling conclusion to Watchmen highlights how ideology greatly affects the alleged heroism of Moore and Gibbons' superheroes, and causes us as readers to again renegotiate concepts of heroism and villainy. To frame these concepts, Dwivedi references Plato's concept of a noble lie, the idea that certain lies are permitted given the ends which are to be achieved. For superheroes, do the ends always justify the means? And who makes that decision? Again, the ideology of the superhero in question comes into play and would doubtlessly affect the outcome of these weighty decisions. Rorschach's world is ruled by black and white notions of morality, with no room for ethical negotiation. In his mind, evil should be punished, regardless of the outcome of that punishment, even if the outcome is nuclear winter. He is much more concerned with the means than the ends. The ideology of Ozymandias is much more in line with Plato's concept of the noble lie. He sees the world in acceptable shades of gray and believes himself capable of making decisions for the good of mankind. He is much more concerned with the ends than the means. So who is right and who is wrong? Dwivedi hesitates to say, rather encouraging readers to consider the complexity of these issues instead of taking a side. He concludes with this: before labeling these superheroes as insane, sane,
right, wrong. What is more important, I think, is to listen to the music, to analyze, unearth, and study not only what it is that they are doing and what it is that they represent, but also how and why.